Welcome to The Real Heal. I am your host, Dr. Renee Wallenstein, also known as the libidoologist. So if you're ready, let's get into it. Oh, Brianna, I am so excited to have you on the show. Welcome.
Thank you. I'm so excited to be here.
And I cannot wait to dive into your brain and your expertise in the realm of cycle syncing, which is super cool in my opinion. It definitely is a place where I want more of my listeners to go to, because I think we have become so disconnected in our bodies and so hateful. I hate to say that word, but hateful of our cycles. Like we demonize like this thing that happens every month that makes us feel so awful. And part of it's my goal to help them experience their cycles so it's not so awful. So we do a lot of nutrition tweaks and lifestyle tweaks, but like you're actually going to help us today sort of just even get more in tune with our bodies, what's going on, and like how to live, not that our cycle controls us, but how to live in alignment with our cycle, right?
Yeah, absolutely. There's so much we can do on a lifestyle side of things,
Yeah.
but we can't discount the relationship we have with our body. And
Exactly.
I was in that place where I hated my cycle because it was so painful for me. And getting that piece fixed was really when I started to see results myself, because I had did the things like gluten-free, dairy-free, and I'm like, why isn't this working? But I was punishing myself. I was restricting, and it was really when I shifted that relationship that I started to see these lifestyle changes actually feel and be supportive versus a punishment.
I love that. And I was one of those women too. I was very, very much in my masculine energy and like the same every day. And I could understand why I wanted to do different things, different days. And like, for most of my life, I fought it and didn't give myself permission. And only when I started really listening to my body and my cycles and such that it's very harmonious now. Like I don't fight human nature. Like if my body wants something, I listen to it. So, and I know this is like a nice little teaser before we get into the episode, but before we get into all the juicy details of how we do all of this, why don't you tell us who you are and how you got doing what you're doing? Because you just mentioned a little bit about your story. So let's hear a little bit more.
So I am a certified menstrual cycle coach. But how I came to this work, and I think a lot of people in this space have that sort of personal story, but I struggled with premenstrual dysphoric disorder. So for people who don't know what that is, it's not an imbalance of hormones, but an adverse reaction to the fluctuations that happen across the 30 days and all the hormones that are shifting around. And so for me, that looked like 2 weeks out of every month having debilitating psychological, emotional symptoms. And that was for my first period. So that was what I knew of menstruation from the beginning. So it took years for me to start asking the questions of like, is this normal? This can't be, these other girls who are at the gym, like the week before their period, like we can't be experiencing the same thing. And that's what really sent me on the path of like, I need better answers than the pill or a hysterectomy, which 5-6 years ago, that was still kind of the main options from the medical community. And at the time I was like 23. I'm like, well, first off, even if I wanted to just get rid of the problem, finding a doctor who would be willing to do that was not really on the table either. So that's when I was like, okay, I need to find solutions. And I just started reading and Googling and finding whatever books that I could to really just learn how my body was supposed to work. And that was the big shift, kind of like you were saying, of being in that masculine energy, when I realized like, oh, I'm not supposed to be linear. Optimal for me is not how my husband shows up every day. And that just really gave me so much permission to even have hope that I could heal from my symptoms, because it was like, I just need to soften the edges. I'm not trying to flatten the whole cycle out. But in that process, I really was inspired to bring this to other women, because I was like, we aren't having this conversation until women are up against the wall, not functioning and saying my symptoms are so debilitating. I need to make hormones the focus of my life right now, but really understanding how our cycle works and doing that relational work, those lifestyle things beforehand can prevent you ever getting there and can let you actually go after the things you care about, like your relationships, your career, all of that stuff, but just acknowledging your cyclical self, and that cyclical is optimal for you, for your body.
I love that. I love that. We have to remember we're not 24-hour cycles like men. And that's the thing. I think a lot of us in romantic partnerships, we see our husbands and we're like, why are they on every morning or whatever? And like, I'm on like in the morning, a couple days a week or a couple, yeah. And then like,
Hmm.
then it changes and my cravings are different and my ambition to, do X, Y, and Z, my creativity is different. Like my wanting to be seen on social media is different. Like why, right? And so many women are, again, they fight it and then they get to the point, like you said, even with when you're not being proactive, because it sounds like you do exactly what I do. We're more proactive in our care, that when you get to that point, now it's desperation, right?
Hmm.
Like you were like, it's like, just give me the pill, just take out my uterus, which we know there's a whole host of other problems if you
Hmm.
start, I mean, not even your uterus, you have to take your ovaries out if you want to get rid of your
Right.
cycles. That opens up a whole nother can of worms. And I always say, like, we want to embrace our hormones and keep them as long as we can, because you can't replace what you get taken away. So,
Right.
it's awful for the women that have to have them removed for other medical reasons. But if you can keep them, hold on to them as long as you can.
Yeah, and I think that comes back to that lack of education where
Yeah.
we're grown up, we're grown up, we're taught growing up that it's all about fertility.
Mhm.
So ovulation is important to have a baby,
Yep.
and you're just going to get a period, but we're not really taught about how those connect to our whole body and impact our long-term health, because ovulation, as you know, is so much more than fertility.
Mhm.
Those hormones are impacting our health immediate, but then also perimenopause, menopause, all of those things benefit from that. And so, especially around the conversation with the pill, so much of it for me is informed consent around what you're actually taking off the table. Because
Yep.
it is so often just like, oh, well, you don't want to have kids right now. Great, you don't need this. But it's
Mhm.
so much more integrated into our health and our lived experience as well.
Yep. And I, kind of coming off of that, is exactly what you're saying, is that having a period is only to have a baby. And once you're done with your childbearing years, get rid of it. I think that's the
Hmm.
mentality, even as a conventionally trained gynecologist. It's kind of like, I'd have so many women coming in at, age 40 saying, all right, I'm having period issues. Just take it all out. I don't
Hmm.
need it anymore. Right. And
Hmm.
it's like, oh, hold on here. Like let's have a conversation. It was very difficult for me to do a hysterectomy on any woman, because I
Hmm.
really had to make sure that, it was definitely going to be more beneficial for the procedure versus what was going on. So let's, like, speaking on the fact that so many women, and I experienced this as a gynecologist, they don't know a lot about their bodies. They don't know about their cycles. They don't know about pregnancy, fertility, like all of that. So like, let's start with the basics and go to explaining the 4 phases of the menstrual cycle, if you would.
Yeah, absolutely. So the 4 phases are sort of outlined as these different snapshots of what's happening hormonally. And so the first phase is menstruation, or the menstrual phase. And that's the one we're obviously most familiar with when we're actively bleeding. And what's significant about this phase is that our hormones are at their lowest point. And with that, from an experiential perspective, we lose out on that hormonal buffer that helps us with, nervous system regulation, with moods, with appetite, all of those things that hormones affect. And so that's when we often experience the irritation and things with our environment, because it's like our personal needs feel very loud,
Mm.
and we're very aware of the boundaries that are being crossed, boundaries that we haven't set, and just that tension between the commitments that we have and what our bodies need at that time. But then what we see after menstruation is estrogen starts to rise. And with estrogen, we also get a boost in serotonin. So that's when we get that, it's called follicular phase. And this is when women often feel the most themselves.
Mhm.
And they also can lean harder into the masculine energy, which I think is also why we often feel connected to it, because it's the one we get the most, positive reinforcement from, right? We're more people pleasing because estrogen helps us to be more of a yes person, which all have positive things to them, but then can also lead us into those cycles of burnout where we say yes to everything,
Yeah.
and we have that expectation that we'll be this energetic and this stress resilient the entire cycle. And that's just not how our bodies work. So you can kind of think about it in terms of like when you see your husband or coworker, male coworkers, or those people being like, all right, 8 to 11, they're just like on it, doing all the things, like that's their kind of follicular phase. That's when their hormones are priming them for performance. And then for women after follicular phase, we go into the ovulatory phase when our body's actually ovulating. But that's kind of a 3 to 4 day window because again, our hormones are not, it's not like one day they're there and one day they're not. It's more like a wave. But that's where things peak. Estrogen peaks, with it, serotonin peaks, and then also we get a boost in testosterone.
Mhm.
And that makes us feel more confident, more magnetic. We get the glow in our skin and everything. Our energy is more outward focused at that point, which again makes sense biologically. Our bodies are like, let's make a baby, and we
Mhm.
want to be the most magnetic for that process. And then after ovulation, what happens is we head into luteal phase, which is the time from ovulation to the next period. And here estrogen dips and with it serotonin. So that's where we can feel those wobbles in our mood.
Mhm.
But when everything is balanced and functioning like it should, we get an influx of progesterone,
Mhm.
which does the job of kind of easing the nervous system and help balancing out the sort of heightened awareness and hypervigilance that comes with that dip in estrogen. And biologically, that's important because, again, our body is preparing for pregnancy. So it is on hyper alert to make sure that we're safe in order to make that pregnancy viable. But if we're not pregnant, that can also look like, nitpicking with our partners. It can look like needing to spring clean that day and it has to happen that day, like to the baseboards and noticing everything. And so then when things are out of balance, that's where a lot of nervous system regulation comes in as well to help kind of do the job of progesterone as you heal. And that's definitely a big factor with PMDD as well, when you're not responding to that progesterone in the same way that other women might be. And then you kind of circle back to that menstrual phase as those hormones drop off and send you back into that lower phase place that signals all the things for your period to start.
I love that. Yeah. So you brought it down to like, yes, here are the here's what's going on with your hormones, but like this is how you probably are
Mhm.
feeling. And I think for the women I work with, a lot of it have to do with like cravings and like, and that whole being seen or not being seen. And
Mhm.
so putting yourself out there with big ovulation time when you're like trying to be magnetic, like this, see
Mhm.
me, look at me kind of, and then very much going kind of into the, like, luteal, but then the menstrual cycle of like, don't look at me,
Mhm.
like, um, and even with food, and the cravings
Absolutely.
and women having grace in themselves that like it fluctuates. And I think again, being robots and saying like, no, I'm going to eat this certain way. And like, I'm going to deny my cravings and they're bad. And it's your body, it's just
Right.
biology, right?
Yeah, and cravings are really saying you're hungry.
Yeah.
And the choice there is not so much do I eat or not eat, it's what do I fuel my body with? Because
Correct.
yeah, when you're in that week before your period, the research shows that your calorie output is going up by upwards to like 250 calories a day, more
Mhm.
than the week after your period, right? Because your body's doing a lot more work building out the uterus lining, preparing for your period or for pregnancy. So there's actually biological things that are happening underneath the surface that we don't see and we're not taught to pay attention to that are
Mhm.
driving those cravings. So the cravings are not bad and the cravings themselves are not actually PMS or a symptom. It's normal for our appetite to fluctuate. But when we're not planning for it, that's when it becomes super easy to grab the chocolate bar, grab the chips, grab what's accessible because your brain's saying, like, I need more calories. And also, I don't have as much serotonin. So I want to feel good and I want that quick fix. So even
Mhm.
at just shifting that perspective to adding in more complex carbs into your meals during that, especially the week before your period, can help not only support your blood sugar during that time, which helps stabilize your mood, but it also gives you that boost in serotonin as well, which is super helpful.
I love that. This just kind of comes back to that whole awareness and connection with your body
Hmm.
factor. Like I think so many women that I work with and so many that are in my audience are so disconnected because they're so stressed and overwhelmed and they're just going through the motions and their period is just another hassle and the cravings are moralized that they're bad and I
Hmm.
shouldn't be having them because that's what social media says. Like, I'm having too much sugar if I have cravings and all the things like, oh, we're inundated with all this information and all this moralization around food and, a female cycle. It's like, I just, it drives me crazy. So I think like, number one, awareness around what's going on in your body and two, just connecting to it and seeing where you
Hmm.
are at and what your body asking for essentially with each phase of your cycle, because it's very intuitive, like it knows what it
Hmm.
needs.
But yeah, I think that comes back to learning to actually believe your body, because
Mm-hmm.
we've been, pushed so much to ignore those symptoms, to push past it,
Yep.
to push through pain and discomfort, and even, going to seek help, not always being heard in that process as
Yep.
well. And a lot of times with women that I work with, sometimes I start with just an exercise of like, just notice how many times a day that you like have the urge to get water or to use the bathroom and you're like in 5 minutes, and you kind of push it out. And obviously
Mm-hmm.
there's times that you're in a meeting or you're in the middle of something, and like, it's
Mm-hmm.
not that you always have to drop everything, but just being conscious of those like little things that your body's saying that you already
Mm-hmm.
believe. You already know
Mm-hmm.
when your body says you have to pee, you have to pee. Like,
Yep.
that's not one that you fight. But just recognizing when you like push that off and you're like, well, when it's more convenient for someone else. Like maybe you're in a meeting and someone else is talking, you're like, well, but I don't want to like slip out, even
Mm-hmm.
though it's not even a big deal for you to do that. And just noticing those, because that often reflects bigger ways that we do that when it comes to menstruation, where there's actual stigma
Mm-hmm.
and societal messaging involved.
There's a lot of stigma about being a woman, like the
Hmm.
cycles, menopause, pregnancy, like infertility, all of it. And, I think a lot of our symptoms, or our, not symptoms, but how we're, our cycle is, what our hormones are doing and how it's manifesting in our body is like we perceive it as being a weakness because of
Hmm.
all that taboo around being a woman and being cyclical. And I think, part of this, our conversation today, is removing that stigma of it not being a weakness to have a cycle and be a woman and feel different ways. It's actually our superpower,
Hmm.
right? Because we're good at different things, different times of the month. And I think that's really the context I come from when I try to frame it for my women in my community. Is like, I understand they're kind of coming from the place you came from, where they're having a really tough time trying to help with the symptoms of getting it,
Hmm.
I don't want to say more normalized, because is there really a normal period?
Hmm.
Like more tolerable for them, so they can
Yeah.
start really getting in tune with their body and enjoying the process and not fighting against their bodies. But how do we go about tracking our phases? Like, what do you recommend your clients do to, because here we are, talking about this. And so we have women now, they're educated about the cycles, but they're like, okay,
Hmm.
how do I figure out where I am and what's going on?
Yeah. So the first step, and one that might already be happening, is having like an app or some way to even just mark what day of your cycle that you're on, when your period starts, when it ends, how long your cycle is. That's a great starting point, because without that, you don't have any sort of anchor to figure out where you're landing. And then the other piece that comes in is understanding like what your anchors are. So menstrual phase and ovulatory phase are the anchors in the cycle, and they're the most helpful to start with. If you can figure those out, the other two become a lot more intuitive, because they have actual physical biological markers that you can see. When you're menstruating, you're bleeding, so you can clearly demarcate day one versus the final day. And then around ovulation, changes in cervical discharge happen. It increases in quantity and also inconsistency. So that's when you may be feeling a lot of discharge, feel more wet, be like stretchier, slippery, more slippery. When that's happening, that's showing that your body is in the process of ovulating or
Mhm.
trying to ovulate. And then once progesterone comes in after ovulation, that's when it dries up. So that again shows when that ovulation window closes. So once you can kind of identify those for yourself, because ovulation is sort of like mid-cycle, but that's where there's a lot of variation
Mhm.
within women, because it's not always day 14, depends on how long your cycle is, and then also life factors. If you have a lot going on at work or you're traveling, like that stress can extend that time before you actually ovulate. Your body might try to, but then, just the cortisol and the other things happening in your life can delay it.
Mhm. Got it.
So once you have those anchors, then follicular and luteal is where you kind of have to lean a little bit more into that intuitive feminine side of things, because there isn't an exact day when you'll feel the effect of like the uptick in estrogen
Mhm.
or progesterone coming in. And that's where it's gets to be so unique, where you get to lean in and say, okay, when do I start to feel my energy pick back up? When do I start to feel myself leaning more into like hope in follicular phase or more creativity? And versus like luteal, where you're like, okay, when do I start noticing that I'm pulling back from either social engagements or commitments, or feeling more irritation or tension with the commitments on my calendar? And those are where you get to feel into that process and say, okay, what's my window that I need to start shifting the way I interact, but also shift expectations of myself in those windows as well.
I love that. You can start planning your calendar and your meetings and
Hmm.
your presentations and all the things based on your cycle. But it takes a little time, like you said, not no two cycles are I take that back. Some women have clockwork cycles, but
Hmm.
the older you get, sometimes it changes by a couple days. And so you just have to play with it, like you said, and just know what, I feel like over time you kind of just know once you've connected enough and
Hmm.
see where you at, like, oh yeah, this is what's going on. Like, especially if you experience the cravings or the irritability or whatever, it's like, why am I feeling like this? Oh, look at that. I've done that
Hmm.
several times. Like, oh, that's why. Oh, okay. And I have grace on myself more so than just like,
Hmm.
oh, why am I acting like that? It's natural. We're allowed to have emotions and feelings, and it's just we sometimes have to be careful in how we express
Hmm.
them.
When I
Yeah, but
think what you kind of touched on is the curiosity around it.
yeah.
Instead of being, I shouldn't be acting this way, or I shouldn't be doing this, or shouldn't be eating this, like, oh, why?
Mhm,
Why do all of a sudden I want this snack, or
mhm.
I'm, yelling at my partner or my kids, or, feeling that tension? And when you bring curiosity into it, then you can also bring in self-compassion.
Yeah.
And you can also then communicate it to other people as well, which is so powerful when you can say, like, oh, actually, what I really need is a little bit of support today.
Yeah.
Or I need a minute to myself. I need to step away. Or, you know what, today's the day that we're doing screen time as a babysitter for a
Yeah.
little while, because I need to get some time for myself, and not have that be something that is bad, or
Mhm,
something that means that you're not capable of something.
mhm.
But this is actually how you support yourself so that you can be the best version of yourself for you and for the people that you love.
Exactly. I love that. So for these different phases, like how do we show up differently based on our cycle?
Yeah, so we kind of touched on it a little bit of like
Yep.
how it feels, but with ways that we can leverage it, where we're not just experiencing it in maybe a negative way, but actually take advantage
Yep.
of these different emotions and hormone fluctuations, is for menstrual phase. It often gets like such a bad rap, right? Because there you can have cramps and bloating and all these things, but what you'll probably notice when you start paying attention is the most feeling of like sensitivity and self-doubt really happens like the days right before your period, where you feel like maybe I should quit my job, maybe I need to get out of this relationship, maybe, like all of those sort of life evaluative questions, and it feels a little murky. But once your period starts, and in those like first few days, you'll start to feel a shift where it's like things feel a little bit more clear. It's almost like things settle. And so it's
Mhm,
a great time to lean into reflection. So it's like when those questions and self-doubt come up, it's kind of like hold them. And then
mhm,
as you go into your period, you can actually like sit with those. It's a great time to journal, and it doesn't have to be a long, crazy process, but just think about like, okay, what's the why
mhm,
behind there, and kind of anchor in why those things matter, where you might be seeing some disconnect in your relationship, in your job, and that can really inform things that you ask for, ways that you change, your actions and things moving forward. But there's also kind of a beauty in being able to just like rest in knowing what those action steps are, and not feel pressure that you have to do something on your period either.
mhm,
Sometimes you may want to use that extra like anger and that extra, kind of sense of maybe injustice or things to motivate you to take an action step that you've been sitting on for a while. But you can also just notice things and say, how does this inform how I show up in my next phases?
mhm,
And so then when you switch into follicular and you start feeling a little bit more inspired and creative, you can look back to those intentions that you set and say, now, how does that inform like what I want to throw my energy at? What are
mhm,
the things I really want to say yes to that's serving me, that's serving my goals? And then when you get to ovulatory phase, this is one to really kind of have fun with it. Like
mhm,
enjoy this like peak moment of capacity in
mhm,
a lot of ways. So look for ways that you can celebrate it, look for ways that you can just enjoy.
mhm,
And then notice if there's any kind of frustration coming up. Because a lot of
mhm,
times frustration in the ovulatory phase comes from like knowing what you want being
Mhm.
very clear on what you want, but not necessarily having access or an outlet for it. And this
Mhm.
can a lot of times come up in terms of like support or community because you are more social. So it might be like I don't have the friendships that I want anymore, or I don't have the support system. But also, that's when you get to channel that ovulatory energy to like take the bold step, go join a book club, find some way that you can start building that support or asking for what you need at
Yeah.
that time as well. And then once you're in luteal, this is another one where we can feel like it has a lot of negatives because it's the tension and the irritation that can come there. But really the best thing to lean into is like implementation and execution. So when you're thinking about what you've anchored in your intentions during menstrual phase and you've started to make big plans for it in ovulatory, but then luteal helps you see like where are the gaps? What are the
Mhm.
little steps that need to happen to get that done? In family life, it can be like, okay, what are the doctor appointments that I have not set? What are the little things? What are the taxes? The stuff that you just need to do to keep things running. But when you're in your high creativity, you're like, okay, I cannot sit still to do
Mhm.
this thing, or it will take forever to do. And so
Mhm.
some of those shifts is just valuing the strengths that you have in that phase and shifting what you prioritize, because it kind of almost goes back to like a time blocking concept, but instead you're phase blocking. You're saying like, okay, I'm going to put this at a time where my energy and focus is most aligned so that it becomes, a 30-minute task, an hour task, instead of taking an entire day because you're procrastinating and avoiding.
I love that. Yeah. So, I mean, again, you can plan your month work wise, family wise, get all the appointments in second half of your cycle, um, and do all the planning the first half. I love that. What about those with irregular cycles or no cycles? So for instance, menopause, like what do they do?
Yeah, so that's one thing is like before you get to that place, there's so much value in learning your cycle while it is consistent because it informs your experience so much and can help you through those wobbly years. But if you're in perimenopause, one thing is because your cycle is spreading out and stretching, you're going to find yourself landing more often in that luteal phase experience. So the heightened sensitivity, the heightened hypervigilance, things like that. And so any way that you can reflect on your experience of luteal phase from when you did have a more consistent cycle and like what was supportive for you then can help inform that experience, and also leaning a lot into like nervous system regulation.
Hmm.
Because when you do, because you're essentially in a state in some ways of like estrogen dominance, but
Hmm.
not in a wrong, like it shouldn't be that way, that's what's supposed to
Yeah.
happen. But when you're in that experience, it's like, how do you kind of do some of that extra support that progesterone typically is doing?
Hmm.
And and really just being patient with it, and having grace with yourself that this is a normal thing,
Hmm.
and just allowing yourself to be in the experience of it.
Hmm. Yeah.
And the more that you can do that in perimenopause, again, all of these things inform the next season of life. Because when you're able to sit with the tension, because this is a lot of times when we almost get that midlife crisis for women of like, do I really want to be in this job? Do I really want to be in this career? And you're also maybe transitioning from being like a hands-on parent to empty nesting. And so that brings up a lot of identity shifts as well. And so allowing yourself to kind of sit in that and see like, what do I want to take with me into menopause can
Hmm.
be so valuable and helpful, because then menopause is often called a second spring, which is more
Hmm.
reflective of that follicular phase. And if you've done that work and you've allowed yourself to sit in the tension of perimenopause, you can then step into menopause where now things feel a little bit more balanced. You'll typically have more energy,
Yeah.
and then can actually lean into and do the things that are for you, because you're now no longer having all these people so dependent on you for survival, which gives you this like new experience of, and some people have called it like a return to girlhood in some ways, where it's just like, oh, there's so much freedom there.
Yeah. And you don't have that cycle of your hormones. So
Mhm.
you're a little more, I don't want to say even, but you're a little more like a man in that you're like, you don't have
Yeah.
that 28-day cycle. You can be a little more on if you want to, and with a little less responsibility, with our cycles, that's a really busy time, especially if you have children and all the things
Mhm.
going on and you're trying to navigate the ups and downs of estrogen, progesterone, and they're beautiful symphony, but sometimes it's just like, ah! And you have to, I mean, again, embrace it. Like, I think once we stop fighting it and give ourselves permission to feel a certain way, it's a lot more empowering than like fighting it and saying like, why am I feeling like this? One of the things you actually had said this, one of the things I have learned to do now is like, if I'm feeling a certain way, um, I sleep on it. Like if I feel
Mhm.
like I want to quit this or do this, I'm like, okay, I feel like that now. How will I feel tomorrow? And if I continue to feel like this over the next couple of days, perhaps there's something there. Because I'm
Mhm.
very much feeling into the hell yes, human design. I'm a generator, like,
Mhm.
you know, um, going with my gut. But sometimes it's like, okay, where is this my cycle? My hormones that
Mhm.
are doing this. And like don't no rash decisions, like just ride this wave and, you know, maybe journal on it, think about it. And if it's there in a couple of days, maybe it is something that we need to address or take action on, but no rash
Well,
movements,
that's
right?
one thing that they say, like in the cycle seeking space a lot is to bleed on it, as
Yeah.
opposed to just sleeping on it, especially for those bigger decisions. And it's kind of that idea of like let yourself go through a cycle
Yeah.
with that question in mind. I mean, obviously, there's little things that you don't, it's not like every decision has
Yeah.
to go through a
Yeah.
month.
Those are big ones.
But those big ones, and that will also inform like when you're actually ready to take action. Because a lot of times I've felt this where it's like, okay, certain points in my phase, something will come up. And like kind of a silly one was like for a while, I was like, okay, I need to get my bedroom slash office like more organized. Cause every time I hit luteal, I'd be like, oh, it's so cluttered, it's so overwhelmed. Like I need it to be different. But then also like kid stuff would happen, like, life, other
Yeah.
priorities would rise to the top. And so I just let that be. Like, okay, like I hear you. And after 3 or 4 cycles, it was like, okay, no, now this is top priority. And
Yep.
like it may seem silly, but like now I've reached that point where it's like this is going to make a big impact on my day-to-day
Mm.
experience. And now it's time to take action on it. And then it feels less of like something I have to do.
Yep.
It's something that's a little bit more like driven
Yep.
to
And it is
do.
kind of big because I'm sure it was time consuming. So,
Yeah, it
looking
was
at
a
your,
project. So it was
yeah.
like, okay, do I have the energy to take this on?
Yeah. I mean, I think when the audience might think like when we talk big, it's like career change, major life changes, like, relationship ending or
Mhm.
whatever. Like there's that, but then there's also the big tasks of like, cleaning the house or decluttering, or that's time consuming. And if
Mhm.
you don't have it in your schedule, in your 24-hour day with having
Mhm.
kids and a business or what have your work, you got to plan for it. And like you said, it's like it became a priority, not right away, but after 3 to 4 months, it was still there. It's still something
Mhm.
you wanted to work on. Um, so how do we even start going about embodying our cycles? Like, again, we're having everyone listening to us going, you're crazy to love your menstrual cycle. Like, and to like, embrace this cyclical nature of like not feeling the same way 2 days in a row. Like, where do we even start?
Yeah, so once you're tracking, I also have, I think I've shared with you, is a link to, I have a cycle phase mapping guide. And so that's really helping you to lean into what are your current patterns.
Yeah.
Because it's not about going from like, okay, this is the first time I'm hearing it to loving my cycle. It took me years before I could even say that like I was okay with it.
Mhm.
Because I went for a long time where it was like me and my husband talked about my cycle, and not him, like this was from me being like, these are good days and these are bad days. And that
Yeah.
was my whole like concept of my cycle. And it takes time to shift
Yeah.
that because you're changing your relationship with yourself. And that takes time. But what this guide will help you do is to start to just identify what are patterns that you notice and start making connections that aren't just day to day, but actually month to month.
Mm.
And it can be so helpful in connecting back to like feelings of like, oh, I'm not lazy, I'm in a season of productivity versus a season of rest. Or
Mhm.
it's not that I'm not consistent, I'm very consistent, I was just, my window of analysis was too short to see
Mhm.
that consistency. So there could be a lot of healing in just recognizing that these patterns are something that's consistent. And then from there you also have the power and agency to say, what do I actually have a problem with? What do I
Mhm.
actually want to change and work on? Because it can be so overwhelming when you start talking about hormones, the amount of options of things that you can try to feel better. But you get to decide like what your entry point is to
Mhm.
that. If diet and exercise feel the most accessible, like that's a great place to start. But you can also start in your environment with your calendar, the things that actually matter to you. And that's what I tell people all the time is don't like start working on your hormones. Figure out what's your goal right now in life. Are you focused on your relationship? Are you focused on motherhood, on your career, whatever it is? And then figure out like, okay, how can I start to raise my awareness around my cyclical pattern within that? And
Mhm.
that's when you can start to see where shifts can be made and where you can start to shift how you perceive the different versions of yourself.
Mhm. What happens when you have two priorities? Like I always, my family's always my priority, but so is my business. Like where do I shift? What do I do?
Yeah, so I really like this exercise that I've created because you can pick, like, okay, I'm gonna just identify like patterns in my relationship or in motherhood, and then also like what patterns am I seeing in my business, and then you can start to merge those
Okay.
together because part of the idea of balance is that we still have it in a linear concept. That
Mhm.
balance means everything's equal all the time,
Mhm.
but that's not real, especially if you have this 30-day cycle that you're working on. And so
Mhm.
then you get to decide, like, okay, now if I'm thinking about my priorities from this phase perspective, I can listen to my body and
Mhm.
listen to when in my cycle it's saying, like, okay, you've been leaning really far into family lately, or you've been leaning really far into business. And
Yep.
that can help guide you so that you're not losing sight of either of those goals
Yep.
but doing them in an informed way. Because, yeah, if you have both, like you can't go all in one. But there might be times and there might be seasons where you say, like, okay, this month I'm going all in on business. And I know that that means certain things in my family are going on the back burner, but it's also a conscious decision as something that I also know exactly where it is to pick back up after this launch or after, something specific in your business is happening.
I love that. And I was just looked at what app I have. I actually have a free app called Cycle. Cycle? No, Clue. Clue.
Clue.
Yeah.
Yeah, and there's so many free ones. One that I like, it is paid, but it's called the Agenda Period app, and it links your phases
Mhm.
to your Google Calendar,
Oh,
which
jeez.
I love because it like puts it right there, and you can see it on your calendar. You can see when you're like, oh, I have a lot going on that day, and
Mhm.
not everything about cycle syncing is like put the exact thing on the right day. It's also like awareness of like, okay, that's going to be a busy day. How am I going to add in the extra self-care, the extra support to compensate for that additional energy drain as
What was
well?
it? What was that again? What was it
It's
called?
called the Agenda Period.
The agenda period.
Yeah,
Got
and I
it.
can share a link with you as well if you
That's
want.
awesome. Awesome. Thank you. And yeah, we'll make sure we put like links, any links we have in the show notes.
Mhm.
Because I think it's really, I mean, you got to start somewhere. So having
Mhm.
something to track, and again, on our phone is probably the easiest. Although I do have two paper calendars and a phone.
Mhm.
Like where am I at any point? And I have four Google calendars, depending on what email. Like it's crazy. It's
Mhm.
like which calendar do I want that to sync to? Probably my work one, right? But let's just kind of wrap this up by talking specifically about nutrition and exercise, because again, a lot of my audience
Mhm.
wants to talk about those two topics and how they may fluctuate and change. You kind of talked about it a little bit with the complex carbs
Mhm.
during our luteal phase.
Yes.
But you kind of want to give maybe an overview of like how maybe nutrition changes through your month and how exercise may look, because again, a lot of the women I see in my community, like if they are following a nutrition plan, they're very much on saying,
Mhm.
every single day. And same with the exercise. Like, I got to do my work. I got to push through it, even though I don't feel like it. Like, can you just shed some light on that?
Yeah, absolutely. So first with nutrition, the first thing is the change in caloric needs across the cycle, which is what I kind of alluded to before, is when you're in really like few days into your period and up through ovulation, your body's not doing as much work internally related to the reproductive process. So it is more like this is your baseline needs to keep your body running, and then it is much more about the output that's happening externally. How much time are you spending in the gym? How many errands are you running? Is your job on your feet all day? Like those things are going to then factor in how many calories you need to compensate. But then once you shift to luteal phase, now there's a lot more calories being burnt on that internal process. And so that's when cravings go up, but it's also our body's burning those calories. And that's where I mentioned bringing in additional, making up that difference in calories with complex carbs, because it not only helps with that calorie intake, but then also stabilizing your blood sugar, which goes such a long way in stabilizing your mood during that time as well. And so it really comes back to, this idea that all this diet and nutrition information is based on male bodies. And for
Yeah.
them, like, nothing else is going on. It doesn't
Mhm.
take much to create a billion sperm. Like, that's not a big factor. And it's the same every day, right? They're just pumping them out. So for them, it really is about what's happening externally, how much time in the gym, how busy they are. But for us, we have more things going on underneath. And so again, being curious about, like, okay, when was the last time I ate? Did I eat a snack, or did I eat like a mini meal? Like, did I actually eat something that was nutritionally dense that's going to support me through the day that I have? And that's where that grace can come in
Yeah.
with what you're eating. And then on the fitness side of things, there's a lot of like, do this specific workout during this phase. And what that really comes down to is that these different hormones are actually helping your body do different things. So
Mhm.
during the first half of your cycle, even in your menstrual phase, the big conversation around rest during menstrual phase is really about healing. So if
Mhm.
you're having symptoms, if you're cramping a lot, if all of that's happening, then your body needs rest in order to feel safe and to heal. But
Mhm.
if you're not experiencing those symptoms from really the first day of your period, you start to be primed for performance in the gym. So you can go harder, you can go longer, because your body's not focused on any other priority at that point.
Mhm.
But then once you're in luteal phase, things shift, and our bodies don't really recover the same way. So you
Mhm.
can do higher weight exercises, but you don't want to be doing a lot of cardio. You don't want to really be doing exercises, especially like cardio or HIIT, that are longer than 30 minutes, especially if you have symptoms, because past that point, you're then just increasing the cortisol levels in your
Mhm.
body, which do not help you have balanced hormones, don't help you feel good in your body. And so the big thing here is really focusing on recovery and flexibility.
Mhm.
And that's how you can balance out. If you want to spend a longer time in the gym, like, it's just doubling that warm up and cool down. And so you can spend the same amount of time, but make that what you're doing, as far as like the actual exercise, be shorter and less intense on your body. And again, that comes back to listening to your body,
Mm.
because things will feel heavier. Like, I mean, there's a lot of technical things that are happening, like our blood gets thicker, and so it's harder, our body has to work harder for it to flow through the body. So as you're lifting weights and things, it feels heavier, it feels harder to
Mhm.
do. Your body doesn't sweat as well, so it will like release electrolytes and stuff through the pores, but it's not replenishing the same way. So like, you have to increase your hydration. So there's a lot of factors that go into why it feels harder to exercise during this time. And the most important thing is that pushing yourself through that isn't actually building the muscle that you think it's building, or losing the weight that you think it is. Your body will store fat because
Mhm.
it goes into a scarcity a scarcity mode much quicker during luteal, because again, it's trying to make sure that you have enough fuel and resources for a pregnancy. So
Mhm.
pushing through just actually creates the opposite effect that you're really going for. So learning to trust your body goes so far. And then the last thing I'd want to say on that is really like thinking about, when do you evaluate progress? Are
Mm.
you looking to, like, well, last week I was able to do the same workout for double the time and I felt amazing, and this week I can't? Or are you comparing phase to phase?
Mhm.
So really looking at, how did I do last follicular to this follicular versus my period week to follicular week? Like, you aren't the same person essentially. And so that's really doing you a disservice, as well as looking for that linear progress, but looking at it, day to day versus month to month.
Mhm. I love that. Before I really was aware of, I was still a little bit disconnected from my body. I was a bodybuilder back in 2016, 2017. And of course, my coach was a male designing a
Mhm.
program. And, I want to say every like 12 weeks, we do what they call deloads. Like you do like lighter weights and such. But like,
Mhm.
I remember beating myself up and actually messaging him going, I, for some reason, can't like all of a sudden my strength is gone. Like I was
Mm-hmm.
progressing because like, you keep track, and
Right.
I was progressing, lifting the big weights. And then all of a sudden I couldn't hardly, like, I'm going to drop it on my head. I'm like, what happened here? And it's not until like a couple years later, I was like, oh, my cycles were happening. Like if I had
Yeah.
that wisdom back then, I would have had more grace. Meanwhile, I just pushed.
Mm-hmm. And then it's
And
dangerous, especially
yeah,
when you're doing weights like that. It can be really dangerous for you
well,
to
because
do.
you're showing your numbers to a coach, and he's like, oh, what
Right.
happened here? Or
Yeah.
like the scale goes up. Oh, what happened there? I'm like, my cycle, like, oh, no
Yeah.
more carbs for you. I'm like, "Ugh,"
Right. Which is
yeah,
not, and which is, yeah,
exactly.
so bad.
Exactly. I'm much wiser now. Don't worry. But like in retrospect now of living
Mhm.
in a man's world, who, I always said, like, come on, dude, like, gotta understand women's cycles a little bit better. Like, we're different. And um, yeah, I think sometimes just having that knowledge of female cycles, or being a woman yourself, and doing those kind of things, just to have more grace on yourself during different
Mhm.
parts of your cycle, is like really key.
And I
Um,
like that you brought up the idea of too of like even your weight fluctuating
yeah,
because like it's normal for things to fluctuate and right before your period like your uterus grows a little bit. Like
yeah,
it's bigger.
yeah,
And so that sense of feeling a little bit bigger, feeling a little bit more bloated or even when you look in the mirror being like, "Oh, my stomach isn't as flat." That's cuz organs don't work like that.
yeah,
And
yeah,
accepting that that is okay and that's normal and that's not falling behind in your goals either. That's where that evaluation too is like, are you comparing when you feel your most lean and flat in like day 7 or 8 to on your period? Like that's not a fair comparison for your body and it
yeah.
messes with your mind when you do that.
Yeah. Yeah. Speaking of, again, going back to that time of my life, because I feel like that's the time where I was least understood as a woman.
Hmm.
I came back from across the country. So I live in New York, and I was on a vacation in Washington, and my husband scheduled us to fly back on a red eye. And I don't do well. I don't sleep. I don't sleep on
Hmm.
planes. I need to be like horizontal, and like, my eye mask on
Yeah.
and all the things. And I remember, like, I was in competition prep. So like that's a stage of your life. Like you're very, I was probably, I don't know, 6, 8 weeks away from my competition. And so this was like almost time they're going to pull the plug if you're not at a certain level. Right.
Hmm.
I remember on this trip, like I wasn't eating enough. So I feel like one of the hikes I couldn't even go on because I was like, Mom,
Hmm.
with my kids, I had currently 15-year-old teenagers, but like they were probably 12, 11, 12. And I was like, I have to forego that hike today because I just don't have it in me. I can't, I'm just like, I don't feel good. And I just wasn't eating enough. Right. So I
Hmm.
was like, the point of that is like, I was on with my food. Like I'd go to restaurants,
Yeah.
watch them eat. I had pre-made all my food before I left and packed it and took it with me. And that's how diehard I was.
Yeah.
We come back in an overnight. Now, I don't remember where I was in my cycle, but I'm sure my cycle, my hormones had a lot to do with it actually.
Hmm.
And sleep deprivation. I gained 8 pounds,
Wow. Yeah.
8 pounds. And he didn't believe me that I didn't go off the walls,
Yeah, like off your
eating.
diet.
Yeah. For my week vacation. He's like, really? And I was like, he's like, that's a lot of weight to gain just from like not sleeping. And like, even if it is hormonal, I'm like, I'm a freak of nature. I don't know what to say. And literally within that week, it took me a week, it was gone. I was back to
Hmm.
baseline. Right. And I'm like,
Yeah.
what were we saying about, like, I am some freak of nature. It happens, but I'm also a woman who cycles, who
Hmm.
didn't sleep, whose nutrition was on point, but that also goes to show you, like, it's not always about what you eat. Like my food was on point. It's just a lot of the other factors that came into play, including what was going on with my cycle. I probably wasn't
Yeah.
as resilient to the stress. I was probably, God knows, I don't remember where, but like that is the most dramatic story of like just being a woman and having a cycle and just being sensitive to certain things.
Hmm.
And like someone like, no, really 8 pounds? I'm like,
Yeah, not believing you.
yeah. And I can't say that I felt bloated. Like I didn't feel
Hmm.
like I had gained 8 pounds, but it was somewhere. It was probably,
Hmm.
obviously, like inflammation and retention and all the things, and probably my cortisol, right? My
Hmm.
cortisol response. So I'm sorry, I was just went off on a little
Yeah,
tangent
no,
on
but
that
I
one,
mean,
but
even like talking about sleep that you brought up is like the way that our hormones interact with sleep is also different.
yeah.
Because for women, our hormones are like replenishing and resetting, and like the building blocks of that is happening overnight. And typically, I think it's mostly from like 10 to midnight, 10 to 1 is like the prime time for our hormones to reset. But men, and that happens for men as well, like where their hormones are resetting overnight, but then they also continue to do that a little bit throughout the day.
Mm,
So for them, they can handle a little bit more sleep deprivation before it starts to kick in and hit them. And again, where you're at in your cycle and your resilience is going to play a factor in that as well. But that sleep is so important and it does make a big difference. And again, it's just I know like a lot of people be like, oh, well, being a woman's so complicated. And I like to just reframe that a little bit to say, like, we're just more complex. Our
yeah.
bodies are more complex. And so that requires a little bit more thought and care. But yeah, but also I think understanding that brings so much freedom and relief to really give yourself permission to be like, no, I'm not a freak of nature. I'm not crazy. There's actually a difference. And, just, yeah, that permission to exist.
Hmm. Yeah. I always say that too. I say we're complex, but in the most loving way,
Hmm.
because it makes us, we have more angles to us. We have
Hmm.
more, we're not just one way. Like we have lots of phases,
Yeah.
lots of different angles, like a beautiful diamond, right? Um, so that, and again, I always love to bookend my interviews with, again, let's circle back and talk about you a little bit before we end this episode. And, you know, I love to ask if you have something special, like a morning routine you do, because again, you really are connected to your body, and your routine may not look the same, which is the beauty of
Hmm.
this episode. Or it may, I don't know. But do you have a morning routine and an evening routine?
So I've recently implemented a more consistent one because I have three young kids. They're 5, 3, and 2. So the
Mm,
past 5 years have been not a whole lot of consistent morning routines, just
mhm.
with like early wake ups and all those things. You're like, I kind of gave up planning for one because
Yep.
it was more frustrating not to have one. But recently I did implement one and I got this. It's actually a cycle tracking journal. But a mentor of mine created this journal that I love because it is just like open space to journal based on the day that you're in, but it groups days together. So it's
Mm,
like over, 3, 6 months, you can look back and see like, oh, look, all of my day ones, like look what I was noticing and
mm,
all of that stuff. So I'm doing that and I'm actually starting and bookending my day like that. So I get that first in the morning, like, okay, what's my initial sort of baseline feeling going into the day? Maybe what's an intention that
mhm.
I'm setting for the day? And then kind of a reflection at the end of the day, like, okay, how did that go? Like, did it go better than I thought? Did I
Yeah.
do anything specific? Did I notice anything across the day? And so it's really like 5 minutes in the morning, 5 minutes at night. And that has it's been really grounding to
Mm,
do.
mhm.
And I'm excited because this is something I started like this month. So I'm excited to see in the next few months when I get to go back and say, like, oh, what new patterns am I noticing that I
Mhm.
maybe wasn't as aware of before? But just something simple to
No,
feel
I
like
love
I,
that.
mark
Yeah.
something for myself.
Well, and it's yeah, I always say, like, especially like sitting down for like 5 minutes just to journal on something, like where you want to go, like, or like how you're feeling. Like, I think that's super important just to have that you time to connect with self and be like, okay, whatever that may look like as far as journaling.
Hmm.
And I love that you do it in the evening as well, because, I think a lot of times you're bringing it back to your day, and like not necessarily, I always talk about negativity bias, like we focus on what didn't go right in the day. It's
Hmm.
like what went well, like what was your day like, and related to your cycle, like maybe there are some things you didn't respond as well to, or that you wanted to, or you had a certain thought or whatever. Like it's just very reflective and connecting to your body, which I totally love. Final question. Now, this has been the question since 2019, so we're going to keep this one. But what's one thing that you know now that you wish you knew 5, 10, or more, 15, 20, however far you want to go back? What is something that you know now that you wish you knew then?
I mean, I'd like to give you an answer that's different than what we've been talking about this whole time, but for me, it really is like understanding just the basics of how my body worked. Like, if I could
Yeah.
go back, especially because my PMDD experience was from the very beginning,
Yeah.
and that's where for me so much started of like hating my body, hating myself, and kind of a lot of disassociation for me, where
Yeah.
I was like, okay, I live in my head, like this is who I
Mhm.
am in that masculine energy, and feeling like my body was an enemy in a sense because it
Mhm.
was always attacking me, and I just had so many negative beliefs about it. And I think if I could have gone back, to that younger version of myself and just like shifted that perspective, it would have made such a huge difference. And even just like how I lived my life, decisions I made in terms of school or different things, like how I was judging myself in a lot of areas. So it really comes back to just that, like that self-awareness and knowledge and permission.
I love that. I love that. And I think my biggest theme this year is just I always say awareness, but like even
Mhm.
connecting with self. It's like, and that is something I wish I had known sooner too. And it's just come on my radar in 2022. Like, how do we make any changes unless we're aware of what we're already doing, or we're
Mhm.
aware of what's going on in our body? And how do we accept what's going on in our lives unless we know what's going on in our bodies?
Right.
So I think it's super important. And that's really, that was great. Thank you. So to wrap this up, how can my listeners find you? Where do you like to hang out most? Where are you, like, what are you doing right now? You have anything special going on?
Yeah, so you can find me on Instagram. That's typically where I hang out at Brianna Villegas Coaching. And then right now, I'm actually in the next couple of weeks relaunching my one-on-one coaching program. I'd been in sort of beta testing of it, and so I'm really excited about the updates and everything coming to that. It's called Embracing Cyclical. So the idea behind it is really like, how do you actually create a life that acknowledges that you are cyclical, especially when you're in an environment that is very much linear and in a society that's very linear, and there are, you know, unique complications to that. But just coming back to your relationship with self is so powerful in making those shifts. So that's what I'm doing.
I love it. Well, thank you for being here. I appreciate you. I appreciate all your wisdom and expertise on this topic, and, you know, taking us all the way from the very basics to, the little more complex, but also giving us permission to feel into our bodies and our hormones and embrace them, and just be okay with not feeling the same every day. So thank you.
Oh, of course. Thank you for having me.
And with that, I'm out of here. Talk to you again soon.